This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 961 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Real quick before we get to the transactions this week. First, I just want to let you know that this week's podcast and content schedule, it's just like every other week. You get the 4 episodes and then the 1 episode of Late Round Perspective, so 5 in total. And patrons, you're going to get your live stream Q&A, the rankings, all that good stuff. But next week is the holiday, and it's right in the middle of the week. Before the NFL expanded the schedule, it was no big deal because the fantasy season ended after week 16. But it's a big deal now because it's happening during championship week. So my plan is the following. I'll be doing a 15 transactions newsletter and podcast episode for you in week 17. I think it's the most important show that I do each week. It'll help you get your lineups ready for the championship. But that will be the only episode of the show that I do next week. Now, Late Round Fantasy Football patrons, you'll still get my rankings and such. But this podcast will have just 1 episode next week before a little break in early January. Then it's time to start the offseason stuff, which in my opinion is the most important content that I do. So hopefully everyone's on the same page. I just want to make that announcement before the show this week. Now, second, make sure you're checking out Underdog. If your fantasy season is over, or if you just want some more action, head to Underdog. You can draft teams for playoff contests right now, and you don't need a huge bankroll to play. There's the mitten that you can join right now for just $5 per lineup. If you haven't played yet on Underdog, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND if you go and sign up. That'll get you a nice deposit offer once you get going. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Add Tyjae Spears. So Tony Pollard entered week 15 with an ankle injury. That may have played a role as to why Tyjae Spears outsnapped Tony Pollard in their game against the Bengals. He outperformed him too. Spears saw 8 more snaps than Pollard. He ran 27 routes according to PFF. Pollard ran 7. Now, some of that might have been a negative game script, but it also might have been that injury. But Tyjae Spears scored 27.2 PPR points. That was by far a season high. Now, there have been times this season where the Titans have deployed Spears as their pass-catching back in a negative game script. Maybe that was the reason that we saw more Spears than Pollard in week 15. But maybe this Pollard injury lingers. That's why you absolutely need to have Tyjae Spears rostered. Add Jerome Ford. So unfortunately, Nick Chubb has a broken foot. That means that Jerome Ford is set to be Cleveland's 1A in their backfield. He's their lead back, which is more or less what we saw throughout Sunday against the Chiefs. Ford in week 15, he outsnapped teammate Pierre Strong 36-6. He ran 19 routes, Strong ran 3. Now Cleveland closes out their season with 2 decent matchups for running backs. They get the Bengals, which is the 9th best matchup according to adjusted fantasy points allowed, and then the Dolphins, which is the 11th best. And those 2 games could be negative game scripts for Cleveland. And as we know, Jerome Ford is a pass-catching running back. So he's a priority off the waiver wire this week. Add Kendre Miller. Now, another important injury that hit us in week 15 was Alvin Kamara. He hurt his groin. His week 16 status is completely up in the air right now. Kendre Miller would be the back to benefit if Alvin Kamara were to miss any time. He led the New Orleans backfield in snaps on Sunday. He outsnapped Jamal Williams 26-6. He ran 11 more routes. The Saints get the Packers and the Raiders to close out the fantasy season. Neither opponent is all that scary, especially since a probable negative game script against the Packers would simply lead to more volume through the air for Kendre Miller. And that's valuable because the Saints don't have many viable pass catchers. So I think Kendre Miller needs to be added this week. Drop Patrick Mahomes. So Patrick Mahomes hurt his ankle on Sunday. His status right now is week to week, and that makes him a very easy drop in my opinion. Now I know he's Patrick Mahomes. Honestly, you could have dropped him earlier this season in shallower leagues. He's been a completely average fantasy option this year. And here's the thing, you're not going to feel very confident using Mahomes this week with this injury. And then in week 17, the Chiefs get the Steelers. Pittsburgh just allowed their first 20-plus point scorer in Week 15 to Jalen Hurts. They're the toughest team for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. Now, this may seem like a sort of obvious transaction, but it's also a good reminder. Injured players who won't find your lineup over the next 2 weeks don't need to be on your roster. Instead, just get a handcuff or something. Honestly, get anything of value. Add Malik Washington. I think Malik Washington is my favorite low-key add this week. Odell Beckham's no longer a Miami Dolphin. He was averaging 2.5 targets per game for them. That's not a lot, but it's not nothing. And then all the while, Jalen Waddle's banged up. Right now, I have no idea if he's going to play in Week 16. It sounds like his injury is not a major one. But if he's out in Week 16, Malik Washington is Miami's wide receiver too, by default. And in Week 15, Washington ended up hitting a season high and career high 15.4% target share. He ran a route on 70% of Miami's dropbacks. The Zap model liked Washington, so I think he's the perfect kind of player to add this time of year. Add Brenton Strange. So Evan Ingram's on IR, and Brenton Strange basically just took his role in the Jags offense on Sunday. He ran a route on 84% of Jacksonville's dropbacks, which is a really good number for a tight end, and he saw a 28% target share. He was basically the security blanket for Mac Jones. He had an average depth of target of just 4.3 yards. The Jags get the Raiders next week, and Vegas throughout the season, they haven't been very good against tight ends according to adjusted points allowed. So that makes Strange an obvious streamer. Add Jaylen McMillan. As I put in the newsletter, never wrong, just early. You guys have heard me talk about Jaylen McMillan for most of the year. Things are finally starting to come together a little bit. He's still not playing a slot role for the Bucs, which is what I desperately want him to play, because I think he's a natural slot player, but he's seeing more looks in the offense. He has target shares of 25% and 23% over his last 2 games. He's found the end zone in both of those contests. He scored 21.9 and 18.5 PPR points. And over their next 2 games, the Bucs have decent matchups. They get the Cowboys and the Panthers. I don't know if you're going to confidently start Jaylen McMillan in a 12-team league, but he certainly deserves a spot in your bench. Add Kamani Vidal. The Chargers' backfield has honestly been horrible without J.K. Dobbins. Over their last 3 games, all without Dobbins, the backfield, the running backs have combined for just 25 PPR points. Now, they faced 3 tougher matchups, but 25 PPR points for all of their running backs in 3 games is pretty horrific. I'm shouting out Kamani Vidal today, though, because in Week 15, he played 35 snaps against the Bucs. Gus Edwards and Hassan Haskins combined for 15. And yeah, a negative game script's going to do that. Kamani Vidal has been the pass-catching back without J.K. Dobbins. But Vidal also played a significant number of snaps on the Chargers' first drive. It's not like Gus Edwards has been overly effective this year. So you can add Vidal even if it is sort of a desperation type move. Maybe Dobbins isn't ready by Week 17. That's when the Chargers get a really nice matchup against the Patriots. Add Craig Reynolds. So we were all kind of surprised on Monday when it was announced that David Montgomery suffered an MCL injury on Sunday. He's out indefinitely. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is obviously going to get a huge boost. Gibbs is essentially a league winner now. But he likely isn't going to see every single backfield touch. And since it's such a good backfield, Craig Reynolds needs to be on your radar. Now, Reynolds only has 12 touches this year, but this coaching staff has used him in the past when David Montgomery was out. Without Montgomery last season, Reynolds was seeing roughly 32% of the team's running back rushes. If that happens again this season, that could result in double-digit touches when factoring in receiving. The Lions get the Bears and the 49ers over their final 2 games in the fantasy playoffs. Those are 2 top half matchups for running backs by adjusted points allowed. More than likely, you only need to go after Reynolds in deeper leagues, but he could be a flex play in those leagues. And now he's only 1 injury away from being the Lions starter. Add Jaylen Coker. So Jaylen Coker returned to the field for the Panthers in Week 15 after a 3-game absence. He saw a 22% target share. He had a huge 83-yard touchdown. He played alongside Adam Thielen and Xavier Legette. And for anyone wondering, Thielen was the one who played in the slot, at least in week 15. Although Coker did get some run in there too. But Legette's now dealing with a groin injury. That could funnel more targets Coker's way. We may not see a ton of production against Arizona in week 16 because they have been pretty good against wide receivers this year. But week 17, it's a game against the Bucs. That one could be interesting. Add Kenneth Gainwell. So Saquon Barkley missed a little bit of time during the Steelers-Eagles game on Sunday. He's not really commenting on it, but it should be a wake-up call for every Saquon Barkley manager out there. You need to add Kenneth Gainwell. Even if you don't have Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Gainwell should be on your bench. He's the clear number 2 back in Philadelphia. He's played about 4 times the number of snaps as rookie Will Shipley has this year. And he's rostered in just 5% of Yahoo leagues. As I've talked about countless times over the last 2 months, you should have these types of players on your bench right now. Have a player like Kenneth Gainwell over someone who's never going to crack your lineup. Because there is a chance with a Saquon Barkley injury that Kenneth Gainwell would find your lineup. The upside is huge, even if there is only 2 games left. Add Damen Pierce. So one of the hardest parts about this time of year is figuring out team motivation. If a team is out of it, and maybe a player isn't totally 100%, do they just shut that player down? Or does the player still go because playing football is that player's livelihood? At the end of the day, none of us really know. We do know that players generally do play, but you never know what can happen in these circumstances, in these scenarios. All we can do is try to plan ahead. And with the Texans right now, things are kind of interesting. Seth Walder of ESPN shared updated seeding probabilities on Twitter on Monday. He showed that the Texans have about an 82% chance for the 4 seed in the AFC playoffs. They have roughly a 17% chance for the 3 seed. And then there's a 1% chance at the 2 seed. And there's a 0% chance for any other outcome. In other words, their situation is pretty locked in. So that brings me to Joe Mixon. He was banged up a little bit in week 15. And as we know, running backs aren't always fresh as they get into the playoffs. And Joe Mixon means a lot to this offense. So why wouldn't the Texans be overly cautious with Mixon over the next couple of weeks? If he has a small injury, why give him his normal workload? Now, I want to be clear here. Teams usually don't just do this. They usually won't shut a guy down 2 weeks before the playoffs or 3 weeks before the playoffs. But I do think that Houston is kind of in a unique situation right now, where Joe Mixon isn't totally 100% and Houston's seed is kind of locked in. So Damen Pierce, he's the direct early down handcuff. He's the one, if Joe Mixon were to get hurt, we'd be saying to add Pierce. And then Dare Ogunbowale would probably steal some receiving work. Now, like I said, none of this is necessarily likely, but it's a possibility. And to me, you should always plan ahead when you only have 2 more weeks left of this fantasy season. Add Aaron Rodgers. So Aaron Rodgers is ranked as a top 12 quarterback, a QB1 in back-to-back weeks. And yeah, he faced the Jags in week 15. That's the easiest opponent for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. But in week 16, the Jets get the Rams. Despite holding Brock Purdy to very few points this past week, LA is still a plus matchup on paper. And that game has a pretty decent 46.5 point over-under. So Rodgers could work as a quarterback streamer once again. Add Cooper Rush. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, Cooper Rush gets the Buccaneers this week. Tampa Bay has allowed the second most adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this year. When quarterbacks face the Buccaneers, they tend to score 4.2 more points than their season-long averages. Rush is coming off a solid outing in a slightly worse matchup against Carolina, and this Bucs-Cowboys game has a nearly 50-point total. He's definitely in play, at the very least in Superflex formats. Add the Indianapolis Colts defense. So the Colts get the Titans this week, and at the time of this recording, I don't even know who the Titans starter is going to be at quarterback. Either way, though, it's a plus matchup. Because in Mason Rudolph's 3 starts this year, Tennessee allowed 2 top 7 defensive performances. And we obviously know how turnover-friendly Will Levis is. Tennessee on the year is the top opponent for defenses by adjusted fantasy points allowed. The Colts are 4.5-point home favorites, and that game has a 42.5-point over-under. It's a great spot for this defense to produce. So I've got a bonus transaction for you this week. It's to add Alexander Mattison and Amir Abdullah. Sincere McCormick hurt his ankle in the first half of the Raiders game against the Falcons on Monday night. That resulted in a backfield of Alexander Mattison and Amir Abdullah. The fact that McCormick was ruled out of that game in the second half, that's not a good sign for week 16 and maybe even week 17. Now, Mattison got a little bit more early down work than Abdullah did. Abdullah played his typical pass-catching role. He actually scored a touchdown towards the end of that game. So if you look at the fantasy point totals, you'll see Abdullah looking better than Mattison. But despite those totals, I would go with Mattison over Abdullah on the waiver wire. Because in week 16 and 17, the Raiders get the Jags and the Saints. Those are two favorable matchups for running backs. There are also two games where the Raiders could actually keep it close. It could be more of a neutral game script environment. That type of game benefits Alexander Mattison more. He's already been a workhorse for the Raiders this year. He's had 4 games with at least a 70% running back rush share. So you can add both of these players, but I would prefer Alexander Mattison. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can find me on Blue Sky as well with that exact same handle. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.